There is a particular kind of political crisis that authoritarian systems are least equipped to manage, not the crisis that arise from outside, the military setback, the economic sanction, the diplomatic isolation, because authoritarian systems are built precisely for absorbing external pressure, for redirecting blame outward, for mobilizing the nationalist sentiment that transforms foreign hostility into domestic cohesion. The crisis that authoritarian systems cannot manage well is the one that develops inside the system itself, in the space between the official account of reality and the reality that the people operating inside the system can see with their own eyes. When that space grows wide enough, when enough of the people who matter, the security services, the regional governors, the defense industrial leadership, the military command are privately operating on a version of events that the official narrative no longer accommodates, the system does not announce its difficulty. It develops it quietly in ways that are visible to careful observers before they become visible to anyone else, and that by the time they become impossible to deny, to have already propagated further than any single corrective action can address. Something of that nature is unfolding inside Russia right now. It is not a coup. It is not a revolution. It is not the kind of dramatic rupture that produces a single datable moment of collapse. It is the specific kind of systemic stress that accumulates below the threshold of public visibility until it reaches a weight that begins to express itself in ways the system's managers cannot fully control. And the Kremlin's anxiety about what is developing, an anxiety that is visible in the specific decisions being made, the specific personnel being moved, the specific information being suppressed with greater intensity than the standard suppression this system has always practiced, is itself one of the clearest indicators that the people at the center of the system understand that what is happening is not normal difficulty. It is something structurally different, and they are worried about it in ways they cannot fully say out loud. If this is the kind of reporting you want, no spin, no shortcuts, the full picture, subscribe right now. It takes 2 seconds and it keeps this work going. Because what is unfolding inside Russia in the weeks following the Alabuga production loss in the Crimea humiliation of May 12th through 15th is not a single story. It is a convergence of pressures, military, economic, political, and institutional, that are intersecting in ways that are key, producing visible fracture lines in a system that has spent 12 years presenting itself as monolithic. Understanding each pressure individually is necessary. Understanding why their convergence now is different from their individual presence at earlier points in the conflict is what makes the current moment significant. The military pressure is the most direct and the most visible because it expresses itself in outcomes on the ground that satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and the testimony of participants on both sides make impossible to fully obscure. 3 years of high-intensity warfare have consumed the Russian military in ways that the pre-invasion institution was not designed to sustain. The professional officer corps that existed in February 2022 has been devastated by casualties at the senior and mid-grade levels that no military can absorb without institutional consequence. The specific expertise that makes a military more than a collection of armed men, the battalion and brigade commanders who know how to coordinate combined arms operations, the logistics officers who understand how to sustain a force in contact across a 1,000-kilometer front, the intelligence officers who can synthesize tactical reporting into operational understanding has been degraded over 3 years in ways that personnel replacements, drawn from a training system operating under wartime pressure, cannot fully restore. What this degradation looks like in practice is visible in the operational patterns on the front lines in the weeks following the Alabuga strikes. Russian tactical operations have not stopped. Russian forces have not broken or withdrawn from their positions, but the quality of Russian operational planning at the brigade and battalion level, assessed through the pattern of attacks, the coordination between infantry and armor, and, quote, artillery, The ability to exploit local successes before Ukrainian forces can reposition to contain them has been declining in ways that experienced military analysts tracking the conflict have noted with increasing confidence. The attacks are happening. They are producing casualties on both sides and limited territorial movement in both directions. They are not demonstrating the operational sophistication that an institution with its pre-war professional depth would be capable of generating. The degradation is real and it is cumulative, and no amount of personnel replacement addresses it without the institutional knowledge that the replaced personnel carried. The Kremlin is worried about the military pressure not primarily because of what it means for the front line today, but because of what it implies for the institution's capacity over the next 12 to 18 months. The Russian military's senior leadership has been providing internal assessments, portions of which have reached Western intelligence through sources whose reliability is assessed as high, that are considerably more pessimistic about the sustainability of current operational tempo than any public Russian military communication has acknowledged. The gap between the internal assessment and the public communication is not unusual for any military in any conflict. The specific nature of the Russian internal assessment's pessimism focused on personnel quality and institutional capacity rather than equipment and munitions is more difficult to address through the production and procurement responses that the Russian defense industrial system has shown it can mobilize, and the Kremlin understands this distinction. The economic pressure is less immediately visible than the military pressure, but more structurally consequential in ways that operate on a longer timeline and are harder to reverse once they have fully developed. Russia's war economy has been performing by its own reported metrics with a resilience that surprised Western analysts who had expected sanctions to produce more rapid economic deterioration. GDP growth figures, industrial production statistics, and unemployment numbers have all been reported by Russian authorities at levels inconsistent with an economy under severe external pressure. The problem with those figures is not simply that they are produced by a government with incentives to report favorable numbers. The problem is that the specific structure of Russian economic performance in 2024 and 2025 has been driven by defense spending at levels that are not indefinitely sustainable and whose stimulative effect on GDP conceals a deterioration in the civilian economic foundations that will become visible as a constraint on long-term war-making capacity before it becomes visible in the headline figures. The specific indicators that Russian economists working outside the official statistical framework have been tracking tell a different story from the headline numbers. Inflation in the consumer goods sectors most directly relevant to ordinaries. Russian households has been running at rates significantly above the official figures for over a year. The ruble's managed stability has been maintained through capital controls and foreign exchange interventions whose cost to Russia's reserve position is accumulating. The labor market tightness produced by military mobilization, which has removed millions of working-age men from the civilian economy, is expressing itself in wage pressures that are consuming the purchasing power gains the official statistics describe, and the regional economies most dependent on civilian industrial production rather than defense contracts are experiencing conditions that regional governors are reporting through internal channels in terms considerably more difficult than the national headline figures suggest. The Kremlin is worried about the economic pressure in a specific and concrete way that is visible in the decisions being made about fiscal policy, monetary policy, and the allocation of the budget resources that Russia's elevated energy revenues have been providing the central bank's interest rate decisions, which have maintained rates at levels that reflect an inflation environment more serious than official figures acknowledge, are one indicator. The budget allocation discussions that have been occurring within the Russian government through the spring of 2026, in which every ministry outside the defense sector has been receiving funding below the levels their planning assumptions had. The projected are another. the specific language being used in internal Russian government communications about budget sustainability, language that Western intelligence has assessed reflects genuine institutional anxiety rather than routine. The planning conservatism suggests that the people responsible for managing Russia's public finances are operating with a shorter planning horizon than the public communications of the government project. The political pressure is the most complex of the three and the one the Kremlin finds most difficult to manage precisely because the system it has built over 25 years is optimized for suppressing political pressure from below rather than for processing political feedback from within the institutions that the system depends on to function. The specific form the political pressure is taking in the current period is not opposition in any conventional sense. The opposition political figures who might have organized and articulated discontent have been imprisoned, exiled, or killed. The civil society institutions that might have provided channels for political expression have been systematically dismantled. The independent media that might have informed public political consciousness has been shut down or driven abroad. What remains and what is producing the political pressure the Kremlin is worried about is something the system is less well designed to suppress: the accumulation of private discontent within the institutions the system needs. The security services, the regional power structures, the defense industrial management, and the military itself. The specific event that crystallized the Kremlin's current anxiety was not a public political development. It was an internal one, and its significance has been assessed through the specific nature of the response it generated, rather than through public reporting of the event itself. In the second week of May, a group of senior figures within Russia's security and military establishment, their specific identities not publicly confirmed but their institutional affiliations assessed by Western intelligence as spanning the FSB, the military's general staff, and the defense industrial leadership, communicated through channels that the Kremlin's monitoring apparatus detected a shared assessment of the war's trajectory and the leadership decisions that had produced it that was, in the specific terms it used, the most explicitly critical internal communication about the war's management that Russian intelligence services had detected among figures of this institutional seniority since the early months of the conflict. The communication did not call for Putin's removal. It did not constitute a conspiracy or a coup plot in any operational sense. What it represented, in the assessment of the analysts who reviewed it, was something in some ways more significant: the emergence of a shared critical framework among people with the institutional standing to matter, people who have access to the actual intelligence picture rather than the managed version of it, people whose private assessment of what Russian leadership decisions have produced for Russian strategic interests is now sufficiently negative that they are communicating it to each other through channels that carry the risk of detection. The Kremlin detected the communication, the response, a specific series of personnel reassignments, and intensification of internal security monitoring in the affected institutional channels, and a set of direct conversations that Putin conducted with several senior figures in the week following detection has been the most visible indicator of the anxiety the communication produced at the top of the system. Personnel movements are the specific mechanism through which authoritarian systems respond to detected internal political pressure before it reaches the threshold that requires more direct suppression. And the personnel movements in Russian security and military institutions in the week of May 12th through May 19th have been unusually dense by the standards of the preceding year. Several senior figures have been moved from positions of operational authority to positions with equivalent formal status, but reduced access to the intelligence reporting and the decision-making processes that matter in the current phase of the conflict. The movements have been explained through official channels as routine rotation, which is how all such movements are explained in this system, and which is how they will continue to be explained unless the underlying political dynamic requires a more public accounting. What they represent in the analytical framework of anyone tracking the internal institutional politics of the Russian state is something more specific. The Kremlin managing a detected fracture in its institutional coalition through the tools that have worked before, while operating with the knowledge that those tools address the symptom rather than the condition, producing it. The specific thing that makes the current moment different from the institutional difficulties Russia's system has absorbed at earlier points in the war is the convergence. Military degradation, economic strain, and internal institutional discontent have each been present in the Russian system at various points across 3 years of conflict. What is new in May 2026 is their simultaneous presence at levels that are mutually reinforcing rather than independently manageable. The military difficulty increases the economic cost. The economic cost reduces the resources available for the institutional patronage that keeps the political coalition stable. The political instability reduces the quality of the internal communication the leadership needs to make good decisions about the military and economic management. The three pressures are not simply coexistence. They are feeding each other in a dynamic that the system's standard management tools, suppression, patronage, and narrative control, are less well calibrated to interrupt than they would be if each pressure were presenting individually. The Kremlin's specific worry, as assessed through the indicators available to external observers, the personnel decisions, the budget allocation choices, the intensity of information environment management, the specific topics that official communication is avoiding with unusual care, is not that any single one of these pressures will produce a crisis that the system cannot manage. It is that their convergence is creating a trajectory whose endpoint is not clearly visible and whose management requires a coherence of institutional decision-making that the current political dynamics inside the system are making harder to achieve at precisely the moment it is most needed. The system has worked because it has been able to project confidence, manage internal dissent before it reaches critical mass, and maintain the coalition of institutional actors whose collective cooperation is the actual foundation of Putin's power. All three of those functions are under stress simultaneously in ways they have not been before in this conflict, and the Kremlin is worried because the people running the system are sophisticated enough to understand what simultaneous stress at this level implies for the system's long-term stability. Outside Russia, the governments most closely tracking these developments are adjusting their assessments of the conflict's trajectory in ways that are not yet fully visible in public statements, but that are influencing the specific decisions being made about Ukraine's support, about sanctions architecture, about the diplomatic positioning on ceasefire proposals and negotiating frameworks. The assessment that matters most for where this conflict goes is not whether Russia is about to collapse. It is not. And the analytical error of predicting imminent Russian collapse has been made too many times in this conflict to be made again credibly. The assessment that matters is whether the convergence of pressures developing inside Russia in May 2026 is changing the cost-benefit calculation that Russian leadership applies to the conflict's continuation in ways that make a negotiated resolution more achievable than it has been at any earlier point in the war. That assessment is, among the governments with the best intelligence access to what is actually happening inside Russian institutions, shifting toward a cautious and heavily caveated, yes, more achievable, not imminent, not certain, but measurably more achievable than it was 6 months ago, because something huge is unfolding inside Russia, and even the Kremlin is worried about where it leads. The people paying the price on both sides of this conflict, in the trenches, in the bombed apartment buildings, in the families that have been waiting for 3 years, deserve an accounting of what is actually happening in the system. That is determining their fate. What is actually happening is that the system sustaining this war at its current intensity is under a convergence of pressures that its managers have not faced in this combination before, that those managers are worried about it in ways they cannot fully say publicly, and that the specific nature of their worry, institutional, structural, and cumulative, rather than episodic and manageable, is the clearest indicator yet that the war's underlying dynamics are moving, slowly and without any single decisive moment, toward a different phase than the one the preceding 3 years have constituted. What do you think? Is the internal pressure building inside Russia reaching a threshold that will force a genuine change in its war strategy, or does the system's demonstrated resilience suggest it will absorb this convergence of pressures the way it has absorbed every previous difficulty? Drop your answer in the comments below. Every comment pushes this video to more people who need to see the full picture. And if this is the kind of reporting you want, complete, independent, no shortcuts, no spin, subscribe. This channel covers what others skip. It is fully independent. And the support link is below. Every contribution goes directly into keeping this work going.